Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani, and as I said, one thing I'm trying to do more on this channel is answer all the many questions that are coming in. So we got a question from a woman whose long-term marriage with a narcissistic partner ended, and she is experiencing complex feelings of grief about it, and it has been going on for a while. She says she isn't clear whether what she's experiencing is grief or rumination, and what's the difference. So I thought this was a really, really good and important question, because it comes to something we've talked about on this channel many times before, which is this idea of grief. Now, grief in narcissistic relationships is such a complicated space, right? We grieve when we lose something. And I'm always going to come back to this really great quote that David Kessler shared with me, who was a world-renowned grief expert. He said, "We grieve those we love, we grieve those we like, and we grieve those we hate." Loss is loss. And human beings, among other species, we go through an experience when we go through loss. But we often reserve that term grief to only talk about death. And grief can be about any kind of loss. People who go through divorce, they have grief. People whose house burns down go through grief. And people who lose a job go through grief. So loss leads to grief. And the challenging part of grief in a narcissistic relationship is you're losing stuff all the time. You're losing yourself, you're losing hope, you're losing this sort of hope for a future that you thought would look a certain way, or you look back on a life and hope that you'd had a childhood that you wanted or a safe family to return to. So the losses mount up. There can be the daily losses, the daily reminders of how unhealthy the relationship is. And it gets confusing when those good days get peppered in there, and then you still feel that sense of grief. So the loss is a constant, but then there's a whole nother game when the actual relationship ends. And what throws a lot of people off, and one thing that wasn't very clear about this woman's question was whether she wanted the marriage to end or not, in the sense of, did she want to be out of this relationship? Because even when people want the relationship to be over, they're like, I am so glad I'm out of this relationship, that there is still a sense of grief that it's done. Because even though you may be glad that the person is out of your life, all the things that, in this case she was married, the things that it symbolized, being a part of something, having a family, having a life partner, even those sort of intellectual losses are gone. This thing that was in your life is no longer in your life, and your identity shifts. You lose an identity as a married person, whatever it may be. So those losses are there as well. But even if you want it, I think those are the folks who are actually the most sort of thrown off by the level of grief that can sometimes happen. There may be a honeymoon period initially, but again, we know when so many narcissistic relationships ends, there is post-separation abuse too, and there's very messy divorces, so that can also take the grief and complicate it quite a bit. But people will sometimes wonder, like, why am I grieving this? I wanted it done. Now, if the narcissistic person ends the relationship, ends the marriage, as this person was married, that can be utter devastation, because a person can say, I literally tried to do everything a human being could do. I did everything. I gave up all of myself, and this thing is still, I couldn't get it right. And I don't know that you weren't getting it right. I don't know that right is a thing, and may then literally very quickly you'll find yourself replaced by someone else. So there's all kinds of griefs there, as well as core wounds being activated. So that's all the grief stuff. But what this woman's question was about was the grief versus rumination piece. What's the difference? Now, rumination is a absolutely classical and core element of the fallout of narcissistic abuse. When a person's gone through a narcissistically harmful relationship, they will ruminate. They'll ruminate while they're in it, and they'll ruminate when they get out of it. Rumination, just not to be too booky about it, but rumination isn't always a bad thing. If it gets you to a solution, it's actually a good thing. Any of you who might puzzle over something, I'm a big person who does this in the shower. You puzzle over something, you puzzle over something, you puzzle over something. You're like, oh, wait a minute, I could do it this way. That's when rumination's doing what it could do, right? It's getting you to a solution as you kind of keep churning the wheels, right? Rumination in a narcissistic relationship is a bit of a disaster because it doesn't get you to a solution. Many times like, well, what if I said it this way? And why did they say that to me? And did I read that? There's a lot of trying to make sense of something that really doesn't make sense. And to make sense of it, you have to swallow an absolute truth that's really uncomfortable, which is this pattern's not going to change and you're in an unhealthy relationship. So to avoid that, the rumination is the going around. And what happens is if you ruminate and ruminate and ruminate and ruminate and never come to a solution, that's a precursor to feeling depressed and helpless and hopeless, which are also further precursors to feeling more depressed. So in this particular case, it sounds like this person is thinking a lot about the relationship and what has been lost. Rumination is a classical part of grief. It is, people will say when they're in the acute stages of grief, they can't stop thinking about it. They, and the minute they start getting pulled more into normal life, they almost feel like they get snapped back into the grief state. Now, in the early stages of grief, rumination is not only normal, it may be sort of the process sort of unfolding. There's no magical line where we can draw and say this grief has gone on too long, right? It's a really tricky thing. In the DSM, the diagnostic manual, they actually tried to say if it goes like a year, then it's maybe too long. There's a lot of grief experts out there who will say, you know what, let's not put a number on this one. When it comes to narcissistic relationship, I have seen people carry this rumination out, maybe even some of the grief out, for years. The more toxic, the more, often the longer it lasted, and the more confusing the relationship was, especially if the good moments were very good, like they felt good, you really felt like you were part of something, and then the gaslighted, manipulative, icky, critical, awful moments were there. That gap makes it harder. I think if it was like, sometimes trauma bonding can be created in a relationship where it's like you're going between abuse and really bad abuse, right? That's different. But when those good moments felt good, like you felt you were part of something, you enjoyed your lifestyle, your home, the people you knew mutually, family vacations, people will say giving up that stuff, feeling like a part of something, is what really, really fosters the grief, but also fosters the rumination. I do have to say that many times the rumination can be worse when a person is left by a narcissistic person, as though that sense of getting, of somebody, no matter what you tried and how many times you tried to right the ship and get it right, that you got left and you weren't ready for this thing to end. That definitely will foster the rumination more. Where did this go wrong? And because more often than not, when a narcissistic person leaves you suddenly, it's because they found someone else, is that now you're ruminating of how long is that going on? The narcissistic person will, of course, insist that they met the person conveniently the day after you broke up. You know that's not true. So that all the confusion around that, I do think the rumination is worse when the narcissistic person leaves the marriage versus when a person does leave the narcissistic relationship. There's a lot more thinking, planning, thinking ahead that you wanted to be out of this. But either way, the rumination is that getting stuck in the thought loops. It's no longer about loss. The grief part, giving the short answer to this question, I've made very long, yapping. The grief part is the part that's about loss, right? The rumination is the still trying to work the problem. If that makes sense. Now, is there overlap? Absolutely. But that sense of, I lost my home, I sort of feel like I might have lost my place in the world, I lost my identity as a married person. That's grief. I can't believe, like, how, can you explain to me why they kept doing that? That, like, trying to still figure it out, that's rumination. That's really the difference, the figuring it out versus the losses. The two overlap quite a bit. And I would say that when you're really stuck in that rumination, even then that post-narcissistic phase, support groups, education, therapy all become very useful, especially with a therapist who gets this. Because sometimes, and I've said this to every client I've ever worked with, they'll say, Dr. Ramani, I feel ridiculous that I'm taking your time and wasting my money on telling the same story over and over again. But they're not telling the same story over and over again. The story changes with each telling, and a little piece of it is put down each time. But it is hard to turn to friends and think that they'd be able to hear the rumination all the time. People around you, I mean, it's a fact, they do burn out. because they may think that they're hearing the same thing over and over again. Like, they were a bad guy. You should be glad they're gone. It ain't that simple. You need places where people can say, or a person can say to you, it's not that simple. One day you will put it down, and some of this rumination can last a long, long time, sometimes a lifetime. But that's the difference between the two. And those of you who have been in a relationship that ended with a narcissistic person, you've experienced grief, you've experienced rumination. But the piece that often sticks around is the rumination. So I hope this answer was helpful, and thank you again for all the questions we're getting.